Welcome to Top Gun, ladies and gentlemen. We were hit with a virus that was met with silence and spread unchecked. Denials for days, weeks, and months that led to more deaths, more infections, more stress, and more loneliness. Hopefully, nobody missed that news. It was a brand new virus. Over 1.1 billion tests were administered in the U.S. alone, detecting over 99.6 million positive tests. But that does not mean that almost 100 million of you got infected. And in fact, at least 12% of those cases had been found to be cases of reinfection. No natural immunity, apparently, often 3 or more times reinfected. So just this data, the raw data says that while we all lost something, some people were just a little more unlucky or lucky than others in avoiding infection. Personally, I would like to know how to avoid not getting sick, since getting the virus is a function of coming into contact with the virus, being exposed to the virus for a sufficient duration, and being delivered an infectious dose. But I cannot and do not speak for everyone, and this is still a free country, and so we have a new virus. This cannot be denied, and a new solution product. And when you put all that together, if you took those products, brand new, rapidly developed at warp speed, common sense says that you were assuming some level of risk and had been, let's just say, a test pilot, high speed, crash dummy, guinea pig, or whatever term you prefer. And with 85% of Americans in that category, you can come to a general consensus amongst yourselves, your autonomous body, and your informed choice. Not to get political. Still over 5 years after a novel virus had emerged in China in December 2019, for most folks, what had been described generally as the COVID-19 pandemic is in the rear view mirror. Bad news, by official count, over 7 million deaths had been attributed to this novel virus, while according to a recent independent report commissioned by the WHO, the real figure exceeds 20 million, suggesting that a virus that some believe had either naturally spilled over or had, escaped from a lab, had beat Adolf Hitler in the Holocaust 3 times over, without one sentient thought apparently, and in half the time. Good news, hero, you survived. You lived. You got a war story to tell your grandchildren or your children or your girlfriend or who you're trying to pick up at the bar. And some have said it is up to you, the living, to dedicate yourselves to the moral purpose of ensuring that those on our dead had not died in vain. Learn some lessons to make sure this doesn't happen in the pandemic next time. Some may recall a lot of talk about evolving science, and some may even recall how months of discord about the coronavirus epidemic had transformed even the cloth mask into a potent political symbol, touted by Democrats as a key part of communal responsibility. We're going to be tagging on that communal responsibility here, labeled by some GOP leaders as a sign of government overreach and as a scarlet letter pinned on the weak. And only the weak run when the going gets tough. And in an identity politics, even if some say that science is not political, the empirical fact is that most people retreat, run away, evade to ideological echo chambers to reinforce what they want to believe and talk to people that think like them. But guess what? If you hang around a bunch of idiots, what kind of thoughts do you produce? It's like science. Not a part of the solution, but just another part of the problem. And we got a large stack of bodies Right here in Virginia, we could replace every live resident of Stanton. However, the late commander of Apollo 13, Jim Lovell, had said we have basically three types of people in this little old world. Those who make things happen, those who watch what happens, and those who just wonder what in the hell just happened. Which one are you? You're a Top Gun? I hope you're a part of the first. I say, however, there is probably a fourth category, probably far larger than all three of those categories combined. The folks who don't even give a damn on what happens. Just riding bitch on that pickle finger of fate, saying it is what it is, and one day life of living lucky has an inevitable way of just running out. But if you're here at Top Gun, somebody thought that was not you. However, the jury is still out, and the verdict is up to you. In 1963, the late Philip L. Graham, then the publisher of the Washington Post and the newly acquired Newsweek magazine, gave a speech in which he described the daily and weekly grist of journalism as providing what he called a first rough draft of history. However, today, citing 2 Minutes B. Sinclair Television Group, Inc., even the Washington Post most recently informed the courts that the news publishers owe no duty of due care to their readers or to the public at large. No duty, pal, to you or anyone else. They're just there to make some money and sell papers. That is your Bill of Rights summary on the Free Press for today. However, the former president, and what I take to be a personal directive from my commander-in-chief, and not an unlawful order that a man of ordinary sense and understanding would know not to be lawful, had commissioned me personally to summon my courage and commitment to help to write the next chapter of the American story, especially since the press is not finding that to be their duty as a free press. According to the former president, finding light in the darkness is one of the most American things that we do. And so our Top Gun mission, should you accept it, is to do just that. And in the military, in which I'm a commissioned field grade officer, albeit retired, we have what we describe as an AAR, or After Action Review, which is basically reviewing what had been the plan, if there was one, and what had occurred in actions on the objective, as surely we saw, along with the results, with the purpose of distilling lessons learned for the future to be applied. So let's get underway, beginning with what in hell happened in the plan. According to the former president, the plan to get our inspectors on the ground in those early months will always hamper any investigation into the origin of COVID-19. Sadly, we are not Cher. We can't turn back time. Lois, you're going to have to wait for Superman. However, although the U.S. may have failed to get an expeditionary force on the ground in China at the time of the outbreak, playing the blame game, the point the finger game, the WHO, which had declared the pandemic that everybody seemed to agree happened, had dispatched the manpower equivalent of 2 military maneuver brigades of epidemiologists, many veteran epidemiologists, top experts in their fields. And by mid-February 2020, if you had read the 40-page report, you would know they had examined 19 times more cases than had yet been reported in the entire U.S., when many states were beginning to close down. And somebody, no names, was encouraging them to do that. The former SecDef, however, General Lloyd Austin, had said when he was the CENTCOM commander, you can't win a war without the right information. Okay, you can't recognize, you can't do anything about a problem unless you know you even have a problem. Houston, we had a problem. And since we can only rely on what is in the record, this WHO report is the baseline information upon which we must rely. Why? As some may recall from what many had described as the DACA case, decided in June 2020, is a foundational principle of administrative law that judicial review of agency action is limited to the grounds that the agency invoked when it took the action. what was known at the time. And only if those grounds are inadequate, a court may remand for the agency to determine whether the agency can now offer a fuller explanation of the agency's reasoning at the time of the agency action. And we have some current actions. I'll do the FOIA to see if we can get some more information about that. But one would reasonably expect, if they had thought they were going into a highly toxic environment, this expeditionary investigative force from the WHO would have arrived on the scene in the Hubei province looking like Kevin Spacey, Rene Russo, and Dustin Hoffman in the 1995 film Outbreak. However, most reports suggest that that did not quite occur. And so they too must have had some prior intelligence on the situation on the ground in China before they deployed a military invasion force of epidemiologists. After conducting contact tracing when they were on the ground by the thousands per day, the methodology that CDC had formerly credited for disrupting the Ebola outbreak in Zaire, they determined that your chances of catching COVID-19 in China, the source of the outbreak, was less than 5%. So you had a better chance of getting into Harvard than catching, much less dying from COVID-19 in China. Who's going to take a vaccine to prevent getting accepted at Harvard? I don't know. That is a personal decision. And based upon what they had empirically observed, boots on ground, eyes on the objective, they had concluded, and I quote, "It is not clear whether this correlates with the presence of an infectious virus, especially after finding the disease presenting in a pattern of discrete, clustered outbreaks with no wider community spread." Let me explain that. Take, for example, the wet market, a location with which many at least have some familiarity, a venue the size of 9 American football fields, as reported in the Wall Street Journal in January 2020. So large, there is a city street dividing it into 2 sections. By December 30th, 2019, there were only a total of 27 known cases in Wuhan. No fatalities and only 19 cases associated with the wet market. So we do have a large number associated with that venue, but it's only 19. Think of going to a large mall during the holiday season where you will come into contact with thousands of people, taking into account an incubatory period, time fuse kind of release of at least 4 days with COVID-19. And a lapse between initial transmission and when your infection becomes transmissible. One big rule about infectious disease: just because you are infected does not mean you are infectious. In fact, towards the end of your period of infection, you will find going into remission that you will be not infectious at all. You're just sick. You're just like with the flu. That pattern is not going to be tied, however, to one location. Yet in China, that is the pattern that they had found. A pattern that had been consistent despite emerging variants throughout the entire length of the COVID-19 pandemic, which former CIA acting director Mike Morrell had predicted, based on historical accounts, should last no more than 18 to 24 months without pharmacological intervention. Take a look at the clock, and we kind of exceeded even that by a year with pharmacological intervention, which should say something about why we may have wanted to sell vaccines, or at least as they were called. But since this is the pattern throughout the entire length of the COVID-19 pandemic, this suggests, at least to an analyst, that not an infected person was causing this, but rather a contaminated location-based contaminant. However, in the press, or even the Washington Post now tells the courts that the news publishers owe no duty of due care to readers or to the public at large. That probably was not what you heard, or if you were so inclined, read regardless of the news source. In the press, during times historically associated with fear, confusion, and helplessness, even if you're not supposed to scream fire in a crowded theater, you heard the provocative phrase, highly contagious disease. And what did you do? You freaked out. Not a little, but a lot. So much for that badass. However, on February 4th, 2020, had you read the Federal Register, you would know that the HHS Secretary had determined that this scenario had provided a sufficient basis for implementation of a public health emergency, very, very different from a pandemic, which only describes the presence of a disease in a sufficient number of places in the world. Doesn't say anything about lethality or even transmissibility. But they had determined that this public health emergency was warranted under Section 564 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, an amendment that had been passed by your elected members of Congress in 2003. So they should have some idea in terms of what had occurred. And at that time, HHS Secretary had authorized the emergency use of previously unapproved diagnostic tests, 1.1 billion that had been administered during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, not for the general public, but rather limited to members of the military forces and citizens residing abroad, primarily the over 75,000 diplomats assigned overseas, in addition to military dependents and DoD civilians. Are you a diplomat, a military dependent, a defense contractor, or a member of the military at all? So tell me, you look like an intelligent person. Why did you even take that test? Based on the data that we have now, it looks like less than 9% of the people that took the test were even found to have tested positive. And many of them had tested positive 2 or 3 times. In contracting, that is described as an unauthorized commitment, however. And at least in the military, somebody tries to get that money back. Okay? So, that was the same provision under which the unapproved biological product countermeasures had been released. Countermeasures that had been released with no knowledge of infectious dose, how many particles have to get on you. If you don't know how many particles have to get on you, we don't know how many particles have to be fighting back. And so that presents some problems with exactly how effective your vaccine, as it was called, is going to be. And of course, if you don't know that number, you want to have a sufficiently low dose because you don't want to have an autoimmune reaction that may result in a autoimmune response as severe as lethal anaphylactic shock. But that's the risk that you took. You probably knew that. You look like an intelligent person, and so we're just going to leave that there. But that was the same provision, Section 564, that we had used, and you should be very familiar with the term, the Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA, which had been used until these products had been approved, not for effectiveness, but rather for private label marketing that was provided by the FDA to the 3 major vaccine, quote unquote, developers or distributors. And if you were following the events not reported in the news, you would have known this, not now, but years ago. And now for the riveting finale scene. You should know that when Congress had passed Section 564 back in 2003, almost 2 decades before your pandemic, they had determined that the provision could only be used in the event of an attack using a chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear agent, CBRN. Just like the Defense Production Act can only be used to address threats of terrorist attacks, not against you, but against defense programs and missions in what is described as the domestic production base. Yes, you heard immunity. Over 70% of you probably heard immunity, but were deafened to the sound of Defense and Defense Production Act. If this is news to you, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like you failed to read the material before reporting on your first day to Top Gun. Let's hope you improve as this course of instruction continues. Chaplain, can you close us all out in prayer? This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest.